Each and every day, enjoy the Simple Six menu at Subway, an entire made-for-you meal featuring one of 6 6-inch sandwiches like the Italian BMT or Black Forest ham, with any bag of chips and a 21-ounce drink, all for only $6. Subway. Eat fresh.
The BS Report is a free-flowing conversation that occasionally touches on mature subjects. The BS Report. The BS Report with Bill Simmons.
Welcome to the BS Report, Tuesday morning here in Southern California. A sad Tuesday morning. One of the most famous comics of my lifetime, and a very popular person just in general, Robin Williams, passed away yesterday. Chris Connelly on the line right now. How are you?
I'm okay. I feel the way you do, though. I'm sad sad that we're talking about this.
Yeah, I'm younger than you. I don't even remember life without Robin Williams. When he started going on Happy Days as Mork, what year was that? That was somewhere in the mid-'70s, right?
It was like 78, maybe. I think that's about right. Probably a little earlier than that.
Then went to Mork and Mindy, which was a phenomenon. And at some point in the late 70s, I would say he became one of the 5 most famous people on television, right?
It was a pretty spectacular rise, that's for sure. There didn't see much like it, you know. You had, you're in an era when Travolta is going through the roof, also, I suppose. But he was a big figure. There was no doubt about that.
So, what was your reaction when you heard yesterday?
I was shocked. I thought, first I was shocked, like everybody, and then you felt immediately sad. You thought about how much in the movies and in real life, it seemed like he had found ways for people in some kind of despair to feel hope. You know, he obviously had done that in his films, in movies like, Dead Poets Society, and obviously in Good Will Hunting, but he'd also done it in real life. You know, he'd gone into Christopher Reeve's hospital room after he was paralyzed in that accident. They had gone to Juilliard together, and he found a way to get a laugh out of Christopher Reeve. And I think Christopher Reeve's line was, "If I can laugh, I can live."
Right.
And that doesn't even mention all the charity that he did, like for Comic Relief, or the trips he took overseas with the USO, or the stuff he did for the 9/11 benefit. You think to yourself, did we take him for granted? Did we just think we'd have that voice all of our lives? Did we not know that we would only have him for a brief period of time in the long scheme of things?
Did you? I always stay away from Twitter when somebody dies, because I don't really enjoy the whole death experience through Twitter and everybody weighing in and then people getting mad about something. I just didn't want to live through the whole thing. When you found out what happened yesterday? What did you do online?
I had a little of your feeling too. That's funny you say that. It was breaking slowly, and certainly everybody wants to weigh in on Twitter and stuff, and you're gonna hear a lot of beautiful words, like we did from, say, Steve Martin. And then you're going to hear just some reactions that may not strike you quite right. From what I could see, it seemed like people were coming to the moment in the appropriate way. I think people were very much responding to their fond memories of the times he'd made them laugh. He made everybody in America laugh, many more times than once. You really couldn't find a human being who at some point hadn't had Robin Williams just make him laugh so hard, or her laugh so hard that, they couldn't see straight. Whether it was on a Carson show, whether it was on one of those stand-ups, whether it was on Mork and Mindy, or in Good Morning Vietnam, or there were so many ways, in the Bobby McFerrin video for Don't Worry, Be Happy, there were so many ways that he had to get to an audience and to make them laugh. And I'd had the same experience every other journalist had had. I had gone in to interview him for a movie in one of those junket situations where you get, 7 or 8 minutes or 10 minutes working for MTV in that sort of situation. And you'd ask him a question, he'd go off. He would just go off. And half of you is thinking, this really isn't on the point. This might be tough to use in our story about this particular movie. And the other half of you is just laughing your head off. And I know that people who would have watched something like that, I'm sure a lot of people are watching these clips now where Robin Williams is being very funny in a chair across from somebody, and they're seeing, they're seeing someone on television laugh. And maybe for some people watching it, they don't see it as an authentic experience. Maybe it doesn't translate in the way that we would hope. But I promise you, in the room with him, it was just that funny. You weren't laughing to suck up. You weren't laughing for any other reason that he was being really, really funny and really, really clever. He was using everything that he had absorbed over the last, few weeks, or had absorbed in those last 30 seconds, and spewing it back to you in a way that no one else really could, putting it into his Cuisinart and getting it out to you rapid fire and making you laugh.
Yeah, he's one of the best talk show guests ever, I think. You just kind of wound him up and let him go. I think, you would ask maybe if you're Letterman or somebody, maybe you'd get 2 questions in.
And those guys obviously
for 9 minutes.
Really appreciate it. I mean, that he was the last comedian, if you want to codify him that way, on the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson is significant. I think that last Tonight Show was just Johnny, but the penultimate Tonight Show was Robin Williams and Bette Midler. And as I recall, if you can imagine what that must have felt like. I mean, I remember the roll call of the absolute best guests as the Tonight Show kind of wound down under Johnny's rule. Martin Short was there, of course. I mean, just the best of the best. But when you watched Robin, you could see that he had made up a lot of it on the spot. Imagine the guts to do that. Imagine the guts to have that significant a spot and to still be funny just right out of his mind. That amazed me. And of course, Johnny just loved it. And if Johnny loved something, that was the ultimate blessing in comedy.
Yeah, I was thinking about his career. As you said, he's been around for so long and in so many different incarnations. It got to the point where you didn't really think about him, right? Like he'd kind of come and he'd go, and he'd have something good, then he'd have something bad, and it just was the way it went for almost 4 decades. But, like just looking back and the ebbs and flows of his career, he didn't really have that long run. It was like there was always some sort of hiccup. And then he would bounce back, and then there was another hiccup, and then he'd bounce back, and that's just kind of the way it went for him. Like you think about when Mork took off in the late 70s, that was when he was having all his drug problems, and he got that whole Belushi era, and just in general Hollywood, cocaine ravaged a lot of Hollywood because nobody knew it was bad for you, and he got caught up in that and really was somebody that survived when you could argue he easily could have gone the other way. He could have been dead in 1979. He was one of those excess guys, right?
I'm not entirely sure. I couldn't necessarily tell you that there was a parallel between whatever he was doing socially and what he was doing professionally. I don't remember ever hearing that he was in no condition to work or anything like that.
No, I wasn't talking about the professional part. I was just talking that whole era of just basically a lot of the celebrities back then were doing it to the extremes because nobody really knew any better in 1979. You think like the Saturday Night Live cast and Richard Pryor and just a lot of the people down the line. That was kind of that era, right? The musicians.
Like steroids, a lot of people did it who we may never know. I mean, if you want to look at it that way,
True.
There were people who had issues of excess. I think Robin Williams would have been the first person to say that he might have been one of them. The trick always was, he was a hot talent. Like he came at you strong and loud and ready to go. And the movies in particular struggled to find a way to utilize that at first. He was like a fire hose, and it was hard to figure out. I think the movies had a difficult time at first figuring out how to make that work. And I think, again, to look at some of Robin Williams' own quotes from the time, he did not always choose the right projects to play to his skills. And, not that he didn't do good work in the movies in the 80s, but you really have to, you look at something like Good Morning Vietnam as a kind of turning point where for the first time somebody figured out how to use what he could do, and make an effective movie out of it.
Yeah, I wanted to go through basically his career. I thought we could talk about it because Mork and Mindy is a show that has not aged well, and it's kind of hard to explain to somebody why it was why it was so interesting in the late 70s, but there was about a 2-year run there when A, everybody was watching it, and B, he was just on fire. Like he would have been probably the first draft pick if you were like, what comedian is going to own the next decade? I think you would have picked Robin Williams in 1979, 1980. It was just that he was like a force of nature on that show, and it kind of flamed out. But during that time, he made Popeye in 1980, Robert Altman, a big hullabaloo about that film. It was expensive. This was Robin Williams' first big movie, and it wasn't a very good movie, but a lot of people saw it. And I remember my dad took me that. I want to see Robin Williams in a movie, and it wasn't very good, and he was kind of handicapped by the Popeye part, right?
You know, I think that would be how history would sort of regard it, yeah. A lot of talented people in what was sort of, a fish with feathers.
Right.
A thing that didn't, Altman and comic book and Robin Williams, a lot of great tastes that didn't necessarily taste ideal together. Not that people didn't enjoy the movie. But you're right, he was just this, he was like a Bo Jackson. It didn't seem like there was any limit to what he could do. You had to watch him every second because he was going to do something different. And you couldn't tell the joke afterwards, You could listen to a Steve Martin comic album, or you could listen to a Robert Klein comic, anything like that, and you could tell the jokes to your friends afterwards, and they were very funny jokes, and we all enjoyed them. Robin Williams did stuff that you couldn't describe to somebody afterwards. You couldn't reenact it. You couldn't write it down. There are 30 years of journalists, 40 years of journalists, trying to put down on paper the thing that they just saw Robin Williams do on a movie set, the thing that they just saw him do during their interview, and it doesn't translate. You had to be there. It was like watching a tornado come over you, a tornado of laughter and references and things pulled from all sorts of different parts of the day or his life or whatever. And you couldn't tell anybody, but if you hadn't seen it, you wouldn't know how to describe it.
And he was a big improv guy, and Jonathan Winters was like the biggest influence on him. And then there was that last year when he actually wrote Robin Williams into Mork and Mindy, and Jonathan Winters wrote him into Mork and Mindy, and he had a whole role that year, and that was kind of like his mentor. Although if I remember, that character I think it was like Mork's son, but he was an old man. It didn't totally work. But
it's funny because we use the word improvisation to describe Jonathan Winters and to describe Robin Williams, and it doesn't. In a way, improvisation has come for us to mean something like something out of the Second City School or something where there's sketches and you interact with people. And for those guys, it was them interacting with props or interacting with situations, kind of doing it on a solo basis, which was really a little different, Robin Williams wasn't part of a school in that kind of way, in that sense. He could work with anybody, but he didn't have like a clan he hung with that way.
What do you remember about
it? In terms of movies was Peter Sellers. Particularly Peter Sellers when he would play all those different characters, like in the Mouse That Roared or something like that back in the 60s. That was an aspect that he had also.
What do you remember about his stand-up back then?
It was, he was just such a whirlwind. He would exhaust himself, and sometimes he would exhaust the audience, I guess. Sometimes it was just too much for them to handle. But he was faster and quicker and more clever than anyone else. And he wasn't just manic. It wasn't just the speed of it. It was that he was an intelligent guy. He worked in everything in the culture as he would do this stuff. He worked in politics and drugs or relationships or people in the news. He would find a way to incorporate it all in these sort of bursts. And you would watch it and just kind of be amazed. And you'd laugh.
So he did World According to Garp in 82. That was right when Mork ended.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I really like World According to Garp. And I think it's a movie that's kind of become underrated under time. But that was a movie that it basically, it was a different side of him. It was like a muted kind of, thoughtful, just a different type of Robin Williams. And
I think of Garp as kind of an East Coast movie. Like, I'd have to sort of look at it and see, but it's, back in those days, some of those movies would get packaged on the East Coast in a way that almost doesn't happen now. And I think if you look at the lineup for that movie, with Williams as an exception, it was from the Bay Area, a lot of those actors had some sort of New York roots, who were in that. And it wasn't an unsuccessful movie, but it didn't seem to point the way to what he would become in movies.
I really like that movie. Glenn Close is great in that movie, and he's really likable in it. But when you look back and you think like those first couple years, even if he had been like in Caddyshack as, Ty Webb's rival, or just some sort of role that captured how funny he was in one of those early movies, it's just weird that never happened. Because then you go through and it's like The Survivor, 1980, Survivors, 1983, Moscow on the Hudson, 1984, which he was good in, but he's playing a subdued Russian. The Best of Times.
I like Moscow on the Hudson maybe more than you do.
I did. I liked it too.
That's a Mazursky, and I think that scene of him, because he did a lot of that kind of Russian character, like a lot of it. He would a version of that guy turned up in some of the stand-up every now and then.
Right.
He did a lot of accents, a lot of nationalities. It's possible we might have been more sensitive about the way he did those sort of things now than we were then. Couldn't tell you that, but it was all certainly very funny at the time. But that scene, for example, when his character is in the supermarket and he sees all the coffee that's on the shelves, and he just goes, coffee, coffee, coffee. It's one of his more memorable moments in the movies, I'd say.
Yeah,
and of course, he had the lovely Maria Conchita Alonso in that movie too, at the at one of her radiant peaks as well.
Yeah, so Good Morning Vietnam came out in 1987. For some reason, that was the first movie where it felt like he was Robin Williams, and that's a 7-year run where it's like, oh, here's Robin Williams just letting loose.
Yep.
And until that point, from the time Mork ended all the way through when that movie came out, the only time we kind of saw Robin Williams let loose was in talk shows and in comic relief, which comic relief was really, really big at the time. And it really felt like these were like three of comedy's icons coming together.
Did it start that far back? I actually don't remember, but
I thought it was 1985.
I don't doubt it, and you're absolutely right. It was a big, it was a real showpiece for a lot of the things that he could do.
I remember Letterman did a thing for that, and I remember feeling like that was a huge thing that was like a validation, because Letterman never did anything.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh, Letterman's involved. This is like a real thing. And then I think Eddie was involved, and it just kind of captured all that stuff. And they did it for
many years.
3 years, right? 3 or 4 years, something like that. But Good Morning Vietnam was like, that was the first movie he made where it was like, this is only Robin Williams could have made this movie. And he ad-libbed some of it, and it was kind of the first thing that had tapped into all the things he could do in the same movie.
I think Forrest Whitaker laughs in that movie more than he would laugh in his entire career afterward.
Yeah, that's true. It was good. It still holds up too. It's still funny.
And that movie is also kind of, Barry Levinson was really on a roll then. Obviously, he really knew how to get the best out of his performers back then. And that movie's also remembered for that version of Louis Armstrong's "What a Wonderful World" that closes it. That added just kind of the right, that elevated it a little bit with a little more wistfulness. So, yeah, big success for everybody, that one.
And then Dead Poets Society, 1989, one of my favorites.
I think everybody has that cast. You look
Incredible.
at that. You look at all those young people in that movie. That's what Ethan Hawke and Robert Sean Leonard and Josh Charles. It's just incredible. Understand, this was a movie called Dead Poets Society.
Yeah.
The joke at the time was that the only way that it could have been less commercial a title or a scene is if they'd called, this was Harrison Ford's joke, was if they'd called the movie Dead Poets Society in Winter.
You had 3 different incarnations of Robin Williams in a movie, right? Robin Williams where he's just being Robin Williams. Robin Williams where he's playing some sort of character, like the Moscow on the Hudson guy where he gets lost in something. And then like sensitive Robin Williams, which he kind of unveiled a little bit in Garp, but then in Dead Poets Society, that was like, I feel like that was the movie of all the movies he's made that he used the most pieces of the whole Robin Williams experience. Does that make sense?
Because he was still improvising every now and then. I mean, if you look back on what happened on the set there, he was still doing all the crazy stuff he did then. Peter Weir, the director, was still letting him improvise a little bit. Some of even the poetry, I think, is essentially improvised. But by tamping it down, I think he would, I think what happened is he would go to dailies and he would see when he was the Robin Williams we all knew, it was too much. It was over the top. And so he learned to bring it in. And when he brought it in, he had this warmth. He had this compassion that showed through. He was not the bitter comic. He was not the angry comic. He was not the guy who raged out of the spotlight. And I don't know if his taking it down in these movies was a window into his soul or whether he was just very gifted at playing these roles. But you're right. That was the first sign we had of this other thing that he could really do.
And that turned out to be the
glow and try to reach into troubled people's lives to cast some light.
And that turned out to be the English lit majors version of Hoosiers for sports fans.
You're very down on English lit majors. I've read over and over again how happy you were not to have been an English lit major at Holy Cross.
I
wonder what's that all about? Just why the anger? Why?
One of my roommates, the worm Sean Krause, who Dead Poets Society was his favorite movie, and we used to argue about The Natural versus Dead Poets Society. And it really was it's a great movie. I just watched it a week ago, coincidentally enough, weirdly enough, because it's on. It's one of those movies that sucks you in. Then I get mad at Neil's dad. I just feel like Neil's dad could have done more. Like, why didn't he let him act? It was his fault. But he's just so good in it, and he has these improv scenes that you could tell he's making up on the fly because all the high school kid actors in that movie are really laughing, like not in an acting way. Like he's clearly just going off the reservation.
Yep.
It's a great movie. And it's one of those movies, some of those movies from the late 80s, early 90s are super dated.
Yep.
And they just feel like they were made in 1989. I feel like Dead Poets Society could come out right now and people wouldn't know it was made 25 years ago.
I'll let your lips to I don't doubt that you're right. For me, it's a movie that really belongs to that time, and I mean that in the best way. That I remember watching it at the time it came out and thinking, "Wow, this is a nice piece of work. This is getting the best of a lot of people here." And as we would learn, finding a lot of really good young actors who would go on to great success. But they put it on the summer. I mean, you have to acknowledge what a challenge they gave for themselves to do this movie. It should not have been the hit it was. Or it wasn't destined to be the hit it was. They put it out in June. So it got through on the merits. It succeeded on the merits.
Seeing that movie in the theater, I thought Robert Sean Leonard was going to be like one of the biggest stars of the next generation. I didn't see the Ethan Hawke thing coming. And Ethan Hawke ended up being the legacy guy out of all the kids from that movie. But at the time, you would have bet it was going to be Robert Sean Leonard, I think.
And everybody, everyone did great. Everyone did fine. Everyone went on to great success.
I actually looked up Nuwanda, the guy who played Nuwanda, who was kind of the most charismatic of all the kids. Mm-hmm. So I was like, what happened to that guy? That guy was great in that movie. And he stopped acting in like 1993 and now he's like a Hollywood executive.
Well.
So that was weird. So this was a good run for Robin Williams because then Cadillac Man. Awakenings is a movie that has not aged well, but at the time was because it was him and De Niro together and it just was a big deal. And I think it was maybe received better than the movie was. Still wasn't bad. I think there was some Oscar nomination stuff with that. I'm not totally sure.
He broke De Niro's nose making that movie.
I don't remember that story. How did you do that?
There was some sort of little scheduled tussle of some kind. I think De Niro's character reaches out to him, and at some point, according to this great story that Fred Schruers wrote in Premiere at the time, I guess Williams's elbow came up and clocked Bob on the nose, and he kept going. Everybody could hear the crack, and they kept going.
Wow.
But they had to shut down for a week. And this was like when De Niro was, seen as kind of a more baleful character than perhaps we regard him now after the Ben Stiller movies and stuff. So, But it was De Niro's contention, and I'm not here to argue, that in fact, because he'd already gotten his nose broken before, Robin Williams breaking his nose had set it in the right way again. So as a result, it had actually been a cosmetically helpful thing, what Robin Williams had done.
So he makes Fisher King in 91 and then Hook. And this brings me back to my point about how he never had the sustained streak. There was always like some sort of weird hiccup. Hook was a movie that on paper should have been a monster. Spielberg, Julia Roberts, post Pretty Woman, Robin Williams, who's at like his apex at this point, and it just didn't work. What happened?
Again, it was one of those movies where a lot of great elements happened. I don't know if it caught everybody at the right point in their career. Who gives the best performance in that movie is Charlie Korsmo. Charlie Korsmo was amazing in that movie.
Yeah. As
the kid, Charlie Korsmo was on an amazing run of child performances then. I think he'd been in Dick Tracy. Had he been in, I don't know, he's been in a couple of other things around then. He was superb in that. But yeah, it just didn't. It may not have cohered. It wasn't the kaboom that everybody thought it was.
It might have been too much hype. You have to be the first person on the podcast who's ever said the words Charlie Korsmo was on an amazing run back then.
Oh, he was. He was really good. He'd been in What About Bob?
Yeah.
He'd been in Men
He's
Don't
great
Leave,
in What About Bob?
That Paul Brickman movie, the one he did after Risky Business. He was really good. He's got this incredibly important job now, and is left acting. But he was very talented child actor.
So from there, it was up and down. It was, Mrs. Doubtfire, which is still a classic. I think every kid at some point between the ages of like 8 and 11 sees Mrs. Doubtfire, including my kids. Aladdin, he was great.
Well, Aladdin, Aladdin was huge. Aladdin was massive. The first time that the Disney and resurgent Disney animation had sort of thrown the car keys to a guy and said, "You go be funny." They had worked these things really hard, and there hadn't been, to my knowledge, like super duper stars doing the voices to that point. You had Beauty and the Beast, and you had the Little Mermaid. I think I'm getting the time right. And then they just said, "Okay, go," and they let the tape run, and he did all this crazy stuff, and they animated it. They paid him like less than $200,000 for the whole thing. The thing made over $200 million, and they gave him a Picasso afterward.
Really?
Yeah.
Never heard that story.
Yeah. But he's so much fun in that, and that's again, find a way to turn him loose. That was the challenge. In comedy, could you find a way to turn him loose and have him serve the movie, have it work? And that was probably the best way. Have him go and then choose what you like and animate it.
When we were going through the 80s, I forgot one thing that happened. He did SNL, I'm going to say, like, it was one of Eddie Murphy's last shows in the 83-84 season. I'm going to say it was like February. And it was a big deal at the time. Because Robin Williams was everybody had kind of always been waiting for him to host SNL. And Eddie was still on the show. And it was like, wow, this is going to be incredible. And they had the sketch. It was called Firing Line. And it was Eddie. Robin Williams was playing William F. Buckley. Eddie was playing just some random person, and it was about something about this story that blacks were more flammable than whites.
Oh man!
And Eddie was arguing that wasn't true. And at one point, smoke started coming from him, and it was just like it was one of those great SNL moments from the Eddie era. And it felt like such a big show that they were on the same screen because Eddie was, he had already had 48 Hours in Trading Places at that time. He was still in the show.
Uh-huh.
These were probably two of the four biggest comic stars in the world, and they were just on this sketch show at midnight.
I think I told you I followed Eddie the last week he was on SNL. When he was about to go off and do movies and have a music career too.
Yeah.
And the last show he was on, Kool and the Gang was performing. And I sat in his dressing room, I guess, and Kool and the Gang was rehearsing on the monitor above him, and he pointed to Kool and the Gang and he said, "See, all I have to be is that good."
And he couldn't pull it off. So, 97, Good Will Hunting.
Yep. You
Would
know,
you say
very
this was
reminiscent for those of us of a certain age of the Judd Hirsch character in
Ordinary People?
Ordinary People.
Yeah. Yep.
And, you know, and someone like you will always appreciate or will always note the way that he says foul pole when he tells the Carlton Fisk story.
Yep.
He pronounces the accent on pole. So perhaps as wonderful as he was, he may not have been a baseball fan, Robin Williams. But, you know, but he did that great. You know, that was really the pinnacle of that side of Robin Williams used so effectively in that movie. And it seems like it really endeared him to people from your part of the world also.
I have a lot of attachments to that movie because, one, Damon and Affleck, we knew they were filming it for like a year and a half. And it was like, oh, these local kids, keep your fingers crossed for these wacky kids from around here. And then, you know, blossomed into what it became. They filmed it at Bunker Hill Community College, a lot of the professor scenes, which was 4 minutes from my apartment. But he has some great scenes in that. And I think that's his best performance. And I don't want to turn this into what was his best thing, but I just feel like for me, that was the first movie role I thought of yesterday when I was thinking about. I was just bummed out, you know, after hearing the news and just kind of after it set in.
Well, I mean, and there's a reason for that. You know, it's like his passing is tough enough. His passing makes you think, gee, did we appreciate him enough? You know,
right?
Were we he just gave and gave and gave and gave. And you know what a weird thing it is that somebody tries to make you laugh, and if they fail, you get mad sometimes. That has to be the weirdest human response there is. But maybe we took him for granted. Maybe we just thought we'd always have that voice, that kind of, and then it was gone. But then on top of that, to hear about the nature of his passing and why it was happening, you couldn't help but think back to Good Will Hunting. You know, you couldn't help but think back to the way, you know, that the way that on screen he connected with characters who were feeling despondent and found ways to suggest that there might be a better day down the road without being mawkish, without being overly sentimental. Not always, but certainly in that mood.
Yeah, this happens sometimes when somebody famous dies and then they have this body of work that they left behind, and especially movies or TV shows that you've seen before, but some of them will now have a different feel because of either the fact that they died or the way they died or both. And I do feel like that movie is going to be a different experience now watching it because, first of all, he's a psychiatrist. He's tapping into somebody's pain. He's super tormented. You know, and Williams is tormented for a bunch of different reasons than Sean, the psychiatrist was. But the torment that he taps into in that movie obviously was coming from somewhat of a personal place too, I think. And I do feel like that was, of all the characters he played, knowing that reading the stories the last 24 hours, stuff like that, I don't know how much of him was in every character, but I would say that maybe that one was one of the closest to who he actually was. Would you agree?
I wouldn't presume to know, I guess, in a way. You know.
Yeah, that's fair.
You know, he would. You know, in the interviews that I've seen over the last few hours, as you have been reminded of, he would talk about this voice that would whisper to him every now and then. You know, in a potentially malevolent way. I couldn't really tell you that I don't think anyone at this point could tell you what the nature of his, specific depression was. What he did always seem to have, and it was kind of unusual for a comic, he did have this kind of wellspring of deep feeling.
Yeah.
You were so used to the rapid fire stuff, but he genuinely had this warmth to him. And I think that was the thing that would come across when we would see him, play those roles. Whether the darkness that the character himself had gone through had any parallels to what he'd been through in real life may be difficult to say. But that compassion, that human feeling felt real because he was giving all this comedy away. He was like, in every circumstance, it seemed like he was trying to make people laugh, even when he didn't have to. And he didn't. I never got the sense that he was like maniacally driven to do it, as much as I felt like he just seemed to enjoy it. It was an expression of his creativity. It was like he was handed a great jazz player a saxophone, and he had just decided, or she had just decided, to throw some riffs because they could. He had this amazing instrument, and he liked to play it for people.
So that was, I would say, his last big movie moment, and then it goes through, and he made some bad ones after that, and took some heat. Some of the movies were bad, like What Dreams May Come and Patch Adams. Like, these were not great movies.
He didn't, and I think he confessed to this. He didn't always have great, great picking ability. He had specific skills. Some people thought they knew how to use those skills, and they weren't always right, and it didn't always work out. Some people really liked Patch Adams. I can't tell you that I can't tell you that I was one of those people.
Wow.
But it did pretty well. And if you look around the web, it will turn up. Him with that one of those little noses will turn up on some of those photographs or stuff on social media. But some of the qualities that he had could be put in a funhouse mirror by somebody who didn't have a good grasp of the material, or who didn't care about trying to keep it in between the lines.
The most interesting thing he did in recent years was he was on Louis in a really good episode about, I forget, it was a manager, an agent, or somebody they knew. Louis and Robin Williams knew died, and they were pretending to be sad about it for a second before finally admitting that the guy was just a huge a-hole. And then it turned into a whole thing like, oh my God, this was the worst person I knew. And it was just totally out of nowhere that Robin Williams was even on that show. I had no idea. I was like, oh my God, is that Robin Williams? And he was great in it. And the last high profile thing he did was the CBS show with Michelle Gellar that got canceled last year. But
it would have been nice to see someone like a Paul Thomas Anderson tuck him under his arm.
I agree.
And try to put him in a movie the way that he did for, say, somebody like Burt Reynolds. He had an interesting face. He particularly later in life, it had kind of more emotional complexity. And there were things that you could have thought you could do with him, maybe darker things, maybe, more variegated things than the sides we'd seen before. Perhaps that's in the can somewhere, and we'll see it. Perhaps it was brewing, but it would have been good to see something like that.
I was thinking yesterday with the outpouring of how upset people were that he died, but then you think like a year ago when that Crazy One show came out and everybody was like, it's awful, it's just Robin Williams overdoing it as usual as Robin Williams. And you think like there's this weird balance sometimes that we lose when we talk about stuff, when we're consuming sports or pop culture, where it's like these two extremes and there's never any middle ground, right? Where it's like, a year ago people are complaining because he's overacting on a sitcom, and now this happens. It's like, oh my God, we lost one of the great ones. And it's like, well, a year ago you were just crapping on the guy for his TV show. So what? I mean, does any of that strike you when you read all this stuff the last 24 hours?
We all love to feel young. We all love to feel young, and on some level we resent our stars for getting old because they remind us that we got old too. We say we miss their younger stuff. We say that their younger stuff is the stuff that we missed the most, that was the best. And maybe it was in some cases the best, but it was also when we were younger, and we missed that. And so a lot of that kind of repressed feeling is about our own anxiety at getting older. And I think sometimes performers get caught in our own feelings about ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, who knows why somebody would get to the point where they would take their own life, and I'm sure there's a million components that go into it. But I think when you're an artist like that and you're at the top of your game, and you were the guy or one of the guys for a long time, and then it fades into something else, it's really interesting how different people handle that. And we've seen that, like even the Billy Crystal, the 700 Sundays play that he did. He's at a different point of his career now. He's an old comic. And if you remember Billy Crystal's 30 years ago, he was doing Buddy Young Jr., which was a parody of an old comic. Yeah. And now Billy Crystal is the old comic. And I just think like with comedians, I'm always intrigued by how they handle shifting into the different phases of being a comedian. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, when he did the press for that, that TV show, he was still really funny. He was still making people laugh.
Yeah.
He was, I didn't, when you read it, it didn't sound crazy desperate. It just sounded, this kind of how he rolls, theory is back again, I don't know that the fundamental issue in his life by any stretch was the ups and downs of his career.
No, I don't think
for
it was
whatever reason, in that way that you have, there may be other more longer standing, issues that happen there. The sad thing is that you feel like he was still capable of wonderful work.
Yeah.
And you wonder to yourself, was it clear enough what a treasure he was and how irreplaceable he would be if he went away?
Well, and also how hard it is to make somebody laugh for that long. You look at like Jim Carrey. He's been around 20 years. His career has had kind of a little bit of the same ebb and flow that Robin Williams had, where he's, had this huge zenith, 3 huge monster movies in a row, and then it dipped down. He tried serious stuff, came back with a couple movies, dipped down again. And, think about him 15 years from now. Because that's where Robin Williams was at the point in his career, from 78 to 2014, 36 years of trying to kind of stay relevant and stay funny and all that stuff. And I just think it's really hard to remain kind of relevant and funny.
Well, it's like
36 years.
It's like being a
Jesus.
pop star. You can't
right.
You can't think that people will. There's a reason why pop stars are all in their 20s when they're the hottest. It's like
right.
It's not a failure if you're not as big at 50 than you were at 25. When you're a pop star, that's just the way it goes. And I think comedy is the same way. You would have to adjust your expectations, and I would imagine most people manage to do that. The thing that set Robin Williams apart, along with everything else, was how smart he was, how much he kept up with everything. How much even those crazy little riffs brought in everything that was going on in the world at the moment, politically, culturally, socially. He got it all in. He was paying attention. He was in touch with what was happening, and it came out when he would speak. And that elevated his work a lot.
I always felt like there was a lot more lurking in there, which was made it so interesting when he went on Mark Maron's podcast like 4 years ago. And Mark Maron, they just did a deep dive, and it went a whole bunch of places and was riveting, especially some of the stuff about, some of the comics from an earlier era felt like he stole some of the material. And they talked about everything. And
that certainly came up. I'm glad to hear that he addressed, I never heard this you're referring to, but that did come up at the time. He was such a sponge that there were occasional allegations that he would do other guys' acts and stuff. I don't know if that was true. Do you remember what he said regarding that?
Yeah, he basically said what you just said.
Yeah.
And it was interesting just to hear him talk candidly and not have that Robin Williams talk show, I'm trying to entertain the crowd type of edge to it. You know what I mean? It was just like a conversation with him.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about him is I never felt like he was afraid of being candid. I always felt like he was willing to say what he felt was really going on with himself. Maybe the events of yesterday suggested that maybe that was not entirely the case. Maybe we didn't get clear enough picture. Maybe we didn't hear it when he was saying it to us. But he did speak about the challenging times that he had, and he would come clean about that stuff. I don't remember him trying to prevaricate or to not fess up to anything. Another quality in his favor. Yeah,
there's a great Inside the Actor Studio with him too from way back. I don't remember what year it was, but I remember that was kind of like the perfect format for him because he was introspective, but also you had the crowd there that he could play off of, and he could just go on all these different tangents. And same for he went on Dennis Miller's show a couple of times. I used to like Dennis Miller's HBO show, and it was the same thing. It was like a little bit more long form, and he was just a really interesting guy. Well, tough week.
Yeah, really, not just the passing, but the manner of the passing.
Yeah.
You just think so much, wow, like it's a stupid thought. It's much more complicated than that. I think Jimmy Kimmel, tweeted out, if you're sad, tell somebody. And that's a strong message to send. But I think if all of us felt like, wow, do you have any idea, how much laughter you brought into this household, or how many times you made me laugh, when you didn't have to, when it would have been okay if you didn't. Could you possibly know the number of times over all these years that you made all of us laugh? You wish in some way that you communicated that more somehow, right? That's part of the sadness you feel.
Robin Williams, 63 years old. Rest in peace, Chris Connelly. Thanks for talking about him.
Yeah, good to talk to you all. Good to talk to you about this too, Bill. A lot
How
more
many
coming
times
up
did you
on
interview
ABC
him, by the way?
Tonight about it, by the way. So,
how many times did you ever do like a magazine interview about him or anything?
I don't think I ever did anything written, which would have been really hard because you would have to try to transcribe all those riffs and try to have them make sense, which they never did. But I would sit down and, I seem to recall standing with a pregnant woman at one point next to him, and he reached his hand onto the pregnant woman's belly and said, "Hello, Mrs. Voigt," like the basketball. And where did he get that? I don't know. Just that fast, the way it went. And you just love it. It would just make you laugh.
Thanks, as always. We will talk to you down the road on the BS Report. Back probably tomorrow with another BS Report. Until then, talk to you later.
Thanks, Bill.
So I get to sign off. Whoa!
Thank you for downloading the BS Report with Bill Simmons.
Too much fun.
Check out more podcasts at the iTunes Music Store or at Podcenter at ESPNradio.com.
Peace out.
Geico presents Strange Savings Stories. Astronomers detected an interstellar transmission. It stated, Geico, 15 minutes could save you 15% or more. The implications were staggering. Was the cosmos telling us we could all save hundreds on car insurance with Geico? Or did their radar merely pick up a signal from the nearby Rufus and Clyde's morning show? We may never know.
Geico. 15 minutes could save you 15% or more on car insurance.